The story kicks off with Nick Powell, a high school senior who's acing his classes and gearing up to graduate. A few years back, his dad passed away unexpectedly, leaving his mom, Diane, to step up big time. She pulled herself together, sorted out the family's money troubles, and started running Nick's life like a tight ship. Diane's all about Nick landing a safe, predictable job. But Nick, he's got his heart set on writing and literature. He's even dreaming of ditching his graduation to jet off to a writer's workshop in London. Cut to a big party at the Powell house. Diane's throwing a bash to celebrate Nick's smarts. She stands up, gives a proud mom speech, and hands Nick a gift with his name etched on it. But Nick's not feeling the vibe. He sneaks away from the crowd, grabs some cake, and heads to the garage. Sitting by a workbench, he suddenly pulls a shotgun to his face. Yikes! Turns out it's just a wild dream. Nick jolts awake, shaken. Next morning, he strolls into the kitchen where Diane's whipped up a cute smiley-face breakfast. Eggs and bacon. She's flipping through the newspaper when Nick brings up the London workshop. Diane shuts it down fast, brushing him off with a "you know how I feel about that." Clearly, she wants him sticking close to home, chasing a real career. After that rough start, Nick hops on his bike and pedals to school. Here's the twist. He's got a little side hustle going, doing homework for cash. He slips a buddy an assignment in the hallway, pocketing some quick money like it's no big deal. Meanwhile, Peter Egan, Nick's best buddy, is getting hassled in the boys' bathroom by a tough crew led by Annie Newton, a wild girl known for dabbling in small-time trouble. A few days back, she sold Peter a stolen phone, and he paid her half the cash up front. Now she's demanding the rest, but Peter's broke. She warns him she'll chop off his finger if he doesn't pay up soon, then struts out with her posse trailing behind. At lunch, Nick steps in, plunking a stack of bills on Annie's table to cover Peter's debt. He asks if it's enough, but Annie snaps at him to butt out. Nick leans in close and says she's just a mess inside, which, of course, ticks her off. She lunges at him, and chaos breaks out. Soon, they're both hauled to the principal's office. The principal asks what happened, and Nick cracks a joke about Annie having a crush on him. The principal's not amused. He sends Annie home and tells Nick to steer clear of dead-end troublemakers. Back at her place, Annie walks into a dump of a flat she shares with her stepmom, dad, and little brother, Victor. Her stepmom's glued to the TV, puffing on a cigarette, ignoring everything. Annie loses it, yelling at her to feed Victor instead of smoking all day. Stepmom whines to Dad, but he sides with Annie. Next thing you know, the adults are screaming at each other, cussing up a storm. Annie's unfazed. She just feeds Victor herself and heads to her room. That night, Peter swings by Nick's place for a chat. He asks if Nick's hitting up their classmates' party, but Nick's like, "Nah, I've got other plans." Then he sneakily hands Peter a book with a plane ticket to London tucked inside. Peter's eyes widen. He finally gets it. Nick's jetting off to a writer's workshop. When Peter wonders if Nick's mom, Mrs. Powell, knows, Nick shakes his head. He says ever since his dad died, his mom's been smothering him, mapping out his whole life like a control freak. Meanwhile, Annie's out causing chaos with her bad boy boyfriend, Marcus Boehm. They roll downtown, where Marcus jacks a fancy car. Not to be outdone, Annie smashes a jewelry store window and snags a stunning necklace. They peel out in the stolen ride, just as the cops show up. Next morning, Annie's getting ready for school after crashing at Marcus's. He tells her to leave the bag of stolen goods behind, but she's not dumb. She doesn't trust him. That ticks Marcus off big time, so after she leaves, he rats her out to the police. At school, Annie stashes the necklace in her locker. Peter's nearby and accidentally spots her. He's about to bounce when she catches him looking her way. Trouble's brewing, and soon enough, the cops storm in, cuff Annie for theft, and bust open her locker to find the loot. Later, she calls Marcus from jail, furious, saying she knows who snitched. He plays dumb, but she's not buying it. When Nick gets home, his mom drops a bombshell. The airline called and rescheduled his flight. Busted! She knows about his secret London trip, and Nick's scrambling to explain himself. But she's clearly let down. That night, Peter's on his way to a house party when Annie and her crew jump him. She's convinced Peter ratted her out and wants payback. Freaking out, Peter blurts a lie, pinning it on Nick, who he thinks is already jetting off to London. Meanwhile, at the party, Nick's had a change of heart. He ditches his London plans, handing his ticket and hotel info to some random girl. He steps outside for a walk, unaware an old junky car is creeping behind him. It's Annie and her gang. They corner him on a quiet road and start wailing on him. Peter, stuck in the car, watches helplessly as his buddy gets pummeled. Annie taunts Nick, asking who's broken now. Bruised but defiant, Nick fires back that she's the real mess inside. That sets her off. She kicks him hard, and he tumbles down the road, smacking his head on a rock. Panic sets in when one of the gang checks him and realizes he's barely alive. They're freaking out. Did they just kill him? Annie snaps out of it and tells her crew to grab him. They haul Nick into the woods, his watch dropping unnoticed in the chaos. Dumping him in a storm drain and covering it up, they bolt, leaving him behind. After the terrifying ordeal, Annie bolts to her boyfriend Marcus's place and spills the beans. She's killed Nick. Panicked, she pleads for help, crafting a believable alibi. But Marcus freaks out, worried the cops will come for him too, and tries to shove her out the door. Furious at his betrayal, Annie fires back, threatening to expose all the cars he's stolen over the years. Then she storms off to a nearby bridge and torches her clothes beneath it to cover her tracks. The next morning, plot twist. Nick pops out of the bushes, totally fine. No scratches, no bruises. He strolls into school like it's a normal day, chatting up classmates, but crickets. No one sees or hears him. He even chucks a book at a shelf to get a reaction. Nothing. Weirded out, he heads to the principal's office and overhears his mom on the phone, but she can't hear his desperate shouts either. Freaked out, Nick sprints home, only to get slammed by a car and then flattened by a cargo truck. Miraculously, he walks away without a scratch, yet nobody on the street blinks an eye. At home, he finds his mom talking to the police, reporting him missing. He tries waving, yelling, anything, but she's oblivious. That's when it hits him. He might actually be dead. Detectives Kate and Brian dive into the case of Nick's mysterious disappearance. They spot tire tracks creeping into the nearby woods, along with a smashed car mirror glinting on the ground. Word gets back to them about a heated clash between Annie and Nick at school days earlier, so they swing by Annie's place. There she is, perched on the roof, looking lost. Brian, who used to work with her dad, asks if she's seen Nick lately. She shrugs it off, claiming their fight was the last time, but Brian senses she's hiding something. Still, knowing she's struggling with her dad's new marriage, he lets it slide, just tells her to call if anything weird pops up. Meanwhile, a search crew combs the woods for Nick. Elsewhere, Nick's in his room, wrestling with the idea that he's dead. Then a stunning but wounded bird lands on his porch. As it's fading, a healthy version of the same bird pops onto his shoulder. He grabs it, but poof! It vanishes the second the injured one dies outside. That's when it clicks. Nick's not dead yet, just floating outside his body. If his real self dies, this spirit version's toast too. Back in town, Brian drops by Marcus's garage, grilling him about a jewelry store heist. Marcus plays dumb, swearing he was just tinkering with cars, but Brian's not buying it. He leaves with a casual, "Call us if you see Annie." Later, a jittery Marcus corners Pete on the street, warning him the cops are closing in. They sneak back to the woods, pull Nick's body from a storm drain, and stash it somewhere new. Marcus, now paranoid, decides Annie's a loose end he can't afford. He lures her to the train station with a fake "let's talk" vibe. Annie, clueless, invites Pete along, unaware the police are tailing him. When they all show up, Marcus drops the act, whips out a gun, and aims it at Annie. He tells Pete to zip it and scram, leaving the tension hanging thick in the air. Chaos erupts as cops swarm the scene. Annie seizes the moment, snagging the gun from Marcus and bolting to safety. Nick, who rolled up with the police, shouts that they'll nab her, but she yells back, "Never!" Proof she can hear him, even if he's out of sight. The next day, after crashing in the school gym, Annie sneaks into Nick's house and digs through his old photos. She's hit with a realization. They're not so different. Broken homes, distant parents. They've walked the same rough road. Guilt over killing him in a blind rage starts gnawing at her. But before she can process it, Nick's mom barges in and Annie hightails it to the woods where she last saw Nick. Panic sets in. His body's gone from the storm drain. A pack of nicotine gum nearby hints Marcus was there too. Furious, Annie tracks Marcus down, drags him to a ledge, and holds him at gunpoint. He spills the truth. He moved Nick's body to the base of a dam set to open in 30 minutes. As Annie turns to leave, Marcus pulls a hidden gun and shoots her in the stomach. She fires back, nailing his shoulder, then, bleeding bad, calls Detective Brian with Nick's location. The cops race to the dam and fish Nick out just in time. He's rushed to the ICU, barely clinging to life. Meanwhile, Annie, blood pouring from her wound, stumbles into the hospital. Overwhelmed by guilt, she wants to make things right. She slips into Nick's ICU room, begs for forgiveness, and collapses beside him. In a wild twist, Nick's spirit slides back into his body, but it's too late for Annie. She bleeds out, her last act saving the guy she once despised. Weeks later, the movie wraps with Nick visiting Annie's little brother, Victor, and playing with him. A quiet, bittersweet ending.